Every night at exactly 3 in the morning, the bells of Ravenhill Lutheran Church in Milwaukee ring out across the sleeping city. But here's what makes your blood run cold. The church has been locked and abandoned for over 2 months. The bell tower sealed after a tragic accident, and no living soul has access to the mechanism that controls those ancient bronze bells. Yet they continue to toll in patterns that follow no known religious tradition, no recognizable hymn, and no earthly schedule that any pastor or church scholar has ever documented. Before we uncover the dark truth behind these midnight bells that have terrified an entire German immigrant community, I need you to do something for me. Subscribe to Dark Heritage Files right now, because the story you're about to hear will make you question everything you think you know about trust, faith, and the lengths people will go to protect their darkest secrets. Hit that like button if you're brave enough to hear this through to the end, and tell me in the comments what city and country you're listening from. I want to know how far these dark stories are reaching. Now, let's discover together what really happened in that church tower. The truth behind those haunting bells lies buried in the winter of 1894, when Milwaukee's German district harbored secrets that would drive men to murder. According to the fragmented church records and the whispered memories of elderly parishioners who still refuse to speak openly about those events, the nightmare began in the heart of Milwaukee's bustling German quarter. In 1894, the city's third ward teemed with recent immigrants who had fled political upheaval and economic hardship in the German states. Wooden houses pressed close together along narrow streets, their windows glowing with warm lamplight as families gathered around dinner tables, speaking in the familiar cadences of their homeland. Ravenhill Lutheran Church stood as the spiritual cornerstone of this tight-knit community. Built in 1871 by Heinrich Ravenhill, a wealthy merchant who had prospered in the grain trade, the church's Gothic revival architecture spoke of permanence and faith. Its limestone walls rose 40 feet into the Milwaukee sky, topped by a bell tower that housed 3 bronze bells cast in Cologne before their journey across the Atlantic. The largest bell, weighing nearly 2,000 pounds, had been blessed by Bishop Müller himself before leaving Germany. Pastor Eric Ravenhill, Heinrich's nephew, had inherited both the church and the responsibility of shepherding nearly 300 German Lutheran families. At 32, Eric possessed the kind of quiet authority that inspired confidence. His sermons, delivered in fluent German with occasional English phrases for the younger generation, focused on practical Christianity, helping newcomers find work, establishing mutual aid societies, and maintaining the cultural traditions that gave these displaced people a sense of home. The church operated as more than a place of worship. Its basement housed a soup kitchen that fed unemployed dock workers. The parish hall hosted weekly meetings of the German-American Benevolent Society. Most importantly, Ravenhill Church served as an unofficial information center where new arrivals could find lodging, employment references, and guidance through the bewildering maze of American bureaucracy. Klaus Weber had served as the church's bell ringer and maintenance supervisor for 7 years. A skilled craftsman who had worked as a clockmaker in Bavaria, Klaus understood mechanical systems with an almost mystical intuition. He had modified the church's bell mechanism to allow for more complex ringing patterns, installing a system of weighted cables and timed releases that could produce elaborate musical sequences. His wife Anna often joked that Klaus loved those bells more than he loved her, spending hours in the tower adjusting tensions and testing new arrangements. The Weber family lived in a small apartment above the church's administrative offices. Klaus and Anna had no children, but they had become surrogate parents to dozens of young immigrants who arrived alone and frightened. Anna's kitchen always had soup simmering, and Klaus would find odd jobs for newcomers until they established themselves. Their generosity made them beloved figures in the community. As winter settled over Milwaukee in December 1894, The normal rhythms of church life continued unchanged. Sunday services filled every pew. The Christmas preparations brought joy even to the poorest families. Children rehearsed carols in German, while their mothers decorated the sanctuary with pine boughs and candles. Pastor Eric felt blessed to serve such a devoted congregation, unaware that beneath this peaceful surface, deadly currents were beginning to stir. Everything changed on the night of January 15th, 1895, when Klaus Weber's body was discovered at the base of the bell tower by Friedrich Müller, a baker who arrived early to prepare bread for the church's weekly distribution to needy families. Klaus lay twisted on the stone floor of the tower's base, his neck broken, surrounded by coils of rope and scattered tools. Blood had pooled beneath his head, stark against the grey limestone. The official investigation, conducted by Detective Patrick O'Sullivan of the Milwaukee Police Department, concluded that Klaus had suffered an accidental fall while performing maintenance on the bell mechanism. The evidence seemed straightforward: frayed rope, icy conditions in the unheated tower, and Klaus's known habit of working alone at dangerous heights. The coroner's report listed the cause of death as accidental trauma resulting from a fall from elevation. But Anna Weber refused to accept this explanation. She insisted that Klaus had been an expert climber who never took unnecessary risks. More disturbing, she claimed that Klaus had seemed frightened in the weeks before his death, speaking in whispers about problems with the night work, and asking cryptic questions about whether she would be able to manage financially if something happened to him. When pressed for details, Anna would only say that Klaus had discovered something that troubled him deeply about certain church activities. Pastor Eric found himself caught between official conclusions and nagging doubts. He had known Klaus as a careful, methodical man who planned every task thoroughly. The idea of Klaus working alone in icy conditions seemed inconsistent with his character. Moreover, Eric had noticed unusual activity around the church in recent months: unfamiliar men arriving at odd hours, hushed conversations that stopped when he approached, and a general atmosphere of secrecy that seemed at odds with the congregation's normally open fellowship. The most unsettling discovery came 3 days after Klaus's funeral. Anna Weber, while cleaning out her husband's workshop, found a leather-bound notebook hidden beneath loose floorboards. The notebook contained pages of seemingly random numbers, arranged in columns and grouped by dates. Some entries were marked with small symbols, crosses, circles, and triangular marks that meant nothing to Anna or Pastor Eric. The handwriting was definitely Klaus's, but the content made no sense to anyone who examined it. Detective O'Sullivan dismissed the notebook as evidence of Klaus's hobby of tracking bell-ringing patterns and mechanical adjustments. But Anna noticed something that chilled her. The final entry in the notebook was dated January 14th, the day before Klaus's death, and consisted of a single line written in Klaus's careful script: "They know I know. God forgive me for waiting so long." The morning after Klaus's funeral, the church bells began their mysterious midnight routine. Every night at exactly 3 o'clock, they would ring for precisely 7 minutes in patterns that followed no recognizable hymn or traditional call. The sequence was always identical: 3 long tolls, followed by a series of shorter rings in groups of 2, 3, and 5, then concluding with 2 final deep tolls that seemed to echo across the sleeping neighborhood like a warning. In the weeks following Klaus Weber's death, the midnight bell ringing created an atmosphere of unease that permeated the entire German district. Mothers would wake to the sound and instinctively check on their children. Men working night shifts at the breweries and foundries would pause in their labor, listening to the familiar yet unsettling pattern. The bells had become a nightly reminder that something was deeply wrong at the heart of their community. Pastor Eric found himself losing sleep, not just from the bells themselves, but from the growing realization that he might have been blind to activities occurring under his own roof. He began paying closer attention to the people who came and went from the church, particularly during evening hours when normal services weren't scheduled. What he discovered troubled him profoundly. Certain members of the congregation, including some of the most respected leaders of the German-American Benevolent Society, were holding regular meetings in the church basement that had nothing to do with charitable work or spiritual guidance. These gatherings occurred 2 or 3 times per week, always after 10 in the evening, and always involved the same core group of 15 to 20 men. When Eric attempted to join one of these meetings, he was politely but firmly told that these were private business discussions that didn't require pastoral oversight. The leader of these meetings was Heinrich Stolz, a prosperous import merchant who had been one of the church's largest financial contributors. Stolz had arrived in Milwaukee in 1888 with substantial capital and had quickly established himself as an unofficial leader among the German immigrants. His import business, which specialized in German goods and specialty foods, provided employment for dozens of recent arrivals. Stolz's reputation for helping newcomers find their footing in America had made him a trusted figure throughout the community. But Anna Weber began sharing disturbing observations with Pastor Eric. She had noticed that many of the men who attended Stolz's meetings were not regular churchgoers, and some didn't even live in the German district. More troubling, these men would often arrive carrying large canvas bags or wooden crates, which they would store temporarily in the church basement before transferring them elsewhere. Anna had assumed these were donations of food or clothing for immigrant families, but she had never seen any of these supplies distributed to people in need. The mystery deepened when Pastor Eric discovered that the church's financial records showed unexplained donations totaling over $8,000 in the past year. This was an enormous sum for a working-class congregation, equivalent to several years' worth of normal tithing. The donations were listed as coming from anonymous benefactors supporting immigrant assistance, but Eric could find no documentation of how this money was being spent or which immigrant families were receiving aid. Meanwhile, the midnight bells continued their relentless pattern. Local residents had begun to accept the nightly ritual as an unfortunate consequence of Klaus's death, perhaps caused by some mechanical malfunction in the bell system that would eventually resolve itself. But Anna Weber had made a discovery that suggested something far more intentional. She had found a second notebook hidden in Klaus's workshop, this one containing detailed diagrams of the bell mechanism and what appeared to be instructions for creating automated ringing sequences. As February's bitter cold settled over Milwaukee, Pastor Eric made a decision that would ultimately expose the full scope of the conspiracy operating within his church. He began conducting his own investigation, using his position and community trust to gather information that the police had either missed or chosen to ignore. His first breakthrough came from an unexpected source: 12-year-old Johann Brenner, whose family lived 3 blocks from the church. Johann had developed the habit of sneaking out of his house to watch the midnight bell ringing from the churchyard. What the boy had observed over several weeks provided crucial pieces of the puzzle. According to Johann, the bells didn't ring randomly each night. They followed a predictable weekly pattern. Monday through Thursday, the sequence remained identical. But Friday and Saturday nights featured variations, additional rings, different timing, and occasionally complete silence. More significantly, Johann had noticed that men would sometimes gather in the churchyard during the bell ringing, staying just long enough to hear the complete sequence before disappearing into the darkness. These weren't random curiosity seekers. They appeared to be listening for specific information encoded in the bell patterns. Pastor Eric's second major discovery came from examining the church's baptismal and membership records more carefully. Over the past 18 months, Ravenhill Lutheran had officially welcomed 47 new members, all recent immigrants from Germany. But when Eric attempted to visit these families in their homes, he found that over half of the addresses were either vacant buildings or housed people who claimed never to have heard of the individuals in question. This led Eric to a disturbing realization. Someone was using the church's official records to create false identities for people who either didn't exist or were living under assumed names. The baptismal certificates and membership documents provided legal proof of identity that could be used to establish residency, obtain employment, and even apply for American citizenship. The implications became clearer when Eric consulted with Otto Zimmermann, a clerk at the Milwaukee Immigration Office who attended services at a rival German Lutheran church. Zimmermann revealed that Ravenhill Lutheran certificates were appearing with unusual frequency in citizenship applications, often for individuals who claimed to have been living in Milwaukee for years but had no other documentation of their presence in the city. "Pastor Ravenhill," Zimmermann said during their confidential meeting at a downtown cafe, "I've processed over 300 citizenship applications this year, and at least 60 involved people presenting documents from your church. That's more than all the other German churches combined. Either your congregation is extraordinarily civic-minded, or someone is using your church's official status for purposes that have nothing to do with religious worship." As Eric pondered this information, he began to understand that the operation was far more sophisticated than simple document fraud. Someone had created a comprehensive system for providing new identities to people arriving in Milwaukee, using the church's legitimate religious authority as cover. The question was whether these were desperate immigrants seeking to escape persecution or something more sinister. The answer came from an unexpected source. A conversation with Dr. Wilhelm Fischer, the German district's most respected physician. Dr. Fischer had been treating an unusual number of patients with injuries that seemed inconsistent with normal immigrant experiences: knife wounds, burns, and trauma that suggested violent confrontations rather than industrial accidents or poverty-related health problems. "Eric," Dr. Fischer said, his voice heavy with concern, "I've been a doctor for 23 years, and I know the difference between a man injured in a factory accident and a man injured in a fight. Some of the people coming to me with documents from your church have scars and wounds that tell stories of violence. These aren't farmers fleeing crop failures. These are men who have been involved in serious criminal activity." The revelation that potential criminals were being processed through his church hit Pastor Eric like a physical blow. Everything he had believed about his congregation's charitable work now appeared tainted by deception and possibly violence. But the worst discovery was yet to come, and it would shake his faith not just in his community, but in his own family. While searching through his uncle Heinrich's old papers in the church office, Eric found a series of letters that revealed the true scope of the operation. The correspondence, dating back to 1892, showed that Heinrich Ravenhill had entered into a business arrangement with contacts in Hamburg and Bremen who were facilitating the transportation of special passengers to America. These passengers paid premium rates for passage and required discreet handling upon arrival in Milwaukee. The letters made clear that not all of these special passengers were political refugees or economic immigrants. Some were described as individuals seeking to avoid legal complications in the German states, a euphemism that could cover everything from draft dodgers to wanted criminals. The operation generated substantial profits, with Heinrich receiving a percentage of each passenger's payment in exchange for providing documentation and temporary shelter through the church. But the most damning evidence was a letter dated August 1894, just 5 months before Klaus Weber's death. In this correspondence, Heinrich expressed concerns about our bell ringers' growing curiosity about basement activities and suggested that steps might need to be taken to ensure continued operational security. The letter was signed with Heinrich's distinctive handwriting, but more chilling was the response, written in a different hand. The Weber problem will be resolved permanently if necessary. The operation is too valuable to risk exposure. Eric realized that his uncle had been murdered just 3 months after writing this letter, supposedly dying of pneumonia in November 1894. But now Eric wondered if Heinrich's death had been as natural as it appeared. Had his uncle tried to back out of the operation after realizing its true nature? Had Klaus Weber discovered evidence of Heinrich's murder along with the immigration fraud? These questions became more urgent when Eric found Klaus's hidden instructions for the bell mechanism. The notebook contained detailed diagrams showing how specific bell patterns could be used to communicate coded messages. Klaus had developed a system where different combinations of long and short rings corresponded to numbers, which could then be interpreted as dates, times, or other crucial information. The pattern that had been ringing every night at 3 o'clock wasn't random. It was Klaus Weber's dying attempt to expose the truth. By programming the bells to ring automatically, Klaus had created a permanent record of evidence that would continue even after his death. But without the code key, the message remained indecipherable. Eric's investigation took a dangerous turn when Heinrich Stolz confronted him after Sunday service in early March. Stolz, usually smooth and diplomatic, appeared agitated and spoke in urgent whispers about the need to resolve the bell situation before it attracted unwanted attention from city authorities. "Pastor," Stolz said, gripping Eric's arm with surprising force, "these midnight disturbances are becoming a problem for our community. People are starting to ask questions, and questions lead to investigations that could harm innocent families who are simply trying to build new lives in America. Surely you understand that sometimes the greater good requires us to overlook minor irregularities." The implicit threat in Stolz's words was unmistakable. Eric was being warned to stop his investigation or face the same fate as Klaus Weber and possibly his uncle Heinrich. But Eric also realized that he was close to understanding Klaus's message, and that the evidence Klaus had died to preserve might be the key to exposing the entire criminal network. That night, Eric made a decision that would either save dozens of innocent lives or cost him his own. He climbed into the bell tower, carrying Klaus's notebooks and a lantern, determined to decode the message that had been ringing out over Milwaukee for 2 months. What he discovered in those bronze bells would reveal a conspiracy that reached far beyond simple immigration fraud, touching the highest levels of Milwaukee's German-American community and involving crimes that would shock even the most cynical observer. As Pastor Eric examined the bell mechanism by lamplight, he finally understood the brilliant and desperate plan Klaus Weber had devised in his final days. The automated system wasn't just ringing random patterns, it was broadcasting a detailed coded confession that named specific individuals, documented criminal activities, and provided evidence of multiple murders disguised as accidents or natural deaths. Using Klaus's notebook as a cipher, Eric began translating the nightly bell sequence. The message, repeated identically each night, contained 3 crucial pieces of information. First, the names of 12 men involved in the criminal network, including Heinrich Stolz and 2 other prominent members of the church board. Second, the location where false documents were being manufactured, a printing operation hidden in the basement of Stolz's import warehouse. And third, the most horrifying revelation of all, a list of 7 people who had been murdered to protect the operation, including Heinrich Ravenhill and Klaus Weber himself. The immigration fraud was only the surface layer of a much darker enterprise. The criminal network was indeed bringing wanted fugitives from Germany to America, but they were also eliminating these criminals after extracting payment, keeping both the money and whatever valuables the victims had brought with them. The false identities were temporary covers used until the victims could be safely murdered and their bodies disposed of in the Milwaukee River. Klaus had discovered this when he noticed that many of the immigrants who received church documents never appeared for follow-up services or community events. His investigation had revealed that at least 23 people had been processed through the church in the past year and then simply vanished. When Klaus confronted Heinrich Ravenhill with this evidence, Heinrich had initially tried to convince Klaus that these people had simply moved on to other cities. But Klaus's persistence had forced Heinrich to reveal the truth and sign his own death warrant. Heinrich's murder had been disguised as pneumonia, accomplished through gradual poisoning that mimicked the symptoms of respiratory illness. Dr. Fischer, who Eric now realized was part of the conspiracy, had provided false medical documentation while slowly administering doses of arsenic that weakened Heinrich's system until his death appeared natural. Klaus Weber's murder had been staged as an accident, but the evidence showed that he had been struck unconscious before being thrown from the bell tower. The frayed rope and scattered tools were placed after his death to support the accidental fall narrative. Klaus had anticipated this fate and spent his final weeks programming the bells to automatically broadcast his evidence each night, knowing that eventually someone would decode his message. But Eric's moment of triumph in solving the mystery became a moment of terror when he heard footsteps on the stairs leading to the bell tower. Heinrich Stolz appeared in the doorway, accompanied by two other men Eric recognized as members of the conspiracy. Stolz carried a revolver, and his expression showed that the time for subtle threats had passed. "Pastor Ravenhill," Stolz said calmly, "I had hoped you would prove more reasonable than your uncle or our unfortunate bell ringer. But I see that religious conviction can be as dangerous as curiosity when it comes to protecting practical business arrangements." Eric realized that he was about to become the 8th victim on Klaus Weber's list. But Klaus had prepared for this possibility as well. Hidden among his mechanical diagrams was a final innovation that would turn the bell tower into a trap for anyone who tried to silence the nightly message permanently. What happened next would be debated by Milwaukee authorities for years afterward, though the official records remain sealed in the city archives. According to the police report filed by Detective O'Sullivan, Pastor Eric Ravenhill activated an emergency mechanism that Klaus Weber had installed as a safety feature in the bell tower. This mechanism, designed to ring all 3 bells simultaneously in case of fire or other emergency, created a deafening cacophony that could be heard throughout the German district. The sound brought dozens of residents running to the church, including several police officers who were patrolling the neighborhood. When they arrived, they found Heinrich Stolz and his associates barricaded in the bell tower with Pastor Eric, apparently attempting to silence the bells permanently by destroying the mechanism. In the confusion and darkness, Stolz's revolver discharged, killing one of his own men and wounding another. The investigation that followed exposed the full scope of the criminal network. Klaus Weber's coded evidence, finally decoded with Pastor Eric's help, led authorities to the document forgery operation in Stolz's warehouse and to the discovery of personal belongings from at least 18 murder victims hidden in various locations throughout the city. Several bodies were recovered from weighted sacks in the Milwaukee River, including that of Heinrich Ravenhill, whose grave was found to contain only stones and sawdust. Heinrich Stolz and 7 other conspirators were tried and convicted of multiple murders, conspiracy and fraud. 3 were sentenced to death, while the others received life imprisonment. Dr. Fischer committed suicide in his jail cell before trial, leaving behind a confession that detailed the medical aspects of the murders and confirmed the systematic nature of the killing operation. The church's role as an unwitting front for the criminal enterprise was officially absolved, though Pastor Eric struggled with guilt over his failure to detect the conspiracy earlier. He remained at Ravenhill Lutheran for another 12 years, dedicating his ministry to helping legitimate immigrants and working to rebuild trust within the German-American community. The midnight bell ringing stopped immediately after Stolz's arrest, when city workers dismantled Klaus Weber's automated mechanism. But residents of the German district reported that for months afterward, they would sometimes wake at 3 in the morning, listening for the bells that no longer tolled. The silence, they said, was somehow more unsettling than the nightly reminder of the neighborhood's darkest secret. Anna Weber used the reward money from the criminal convictions to establish a scholarship fund for immigrant children, ensuring that Klaus's sacrifice would contribute to legitimate opportunities rather than criminal exploitation. She never remarried, spending her remaining years tending to the small garden behind the church where Klaus had grown vegetables for the community soup kitchen. The case became a cautionary tale about the vulnerability of immigrant communities to exploitation and the importance of maintaining vigilance even within trusted institutions. But perhaps more significantly, it demonstrated how one man's dedication to truth could reach beyond death itself, turning the very symbols of faith, those bronze bells cast in Cologne and blessed by Bishop Müller, into instruments of justice that rang out the evidence needed to stop a conspiracy built on murder and betrayal. The bells of Ravenhill Lutheran Church were eventually melted down and recast, their bronze becoming part of a memorial fountain in the city's German Heritage Park. But on quiet winter nights, when the wind blows just right across Milwaukee's 3rd Ward, old-timers still claim they can hear the echo of Klaus Weber's message, a reminder that some secrets are too important to die with their keepers, and that the truth, like those midnight bells, will always find a way to make itself heard.